بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يتقبل منا صلاة العشاء. آمين يا رب العالمين. We pray that Allah accepts our Isha prayer, and we pray Him to make us among His righteous servants of His. Tonight we're going to continue with al-Fawz al-Kabir fi Usūl al-Tafsīr of Imam Shah Waliullah Dahlawi. And tonight we're going to focus on two things. The first thing is celebrating the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're called the Ayyamillah. And the second thing we'll talk about is the mentioning of the purposes of the stories. So going back again to the beginning of the book, it talks about 5 different sciences that the Quran deals with. One of them talks about those people who have the wrong concept of God or wrong creed. The second thing is the thing that we mentioned yesterday, and that was, or a day before yesterday, sorry, that was about the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has bestowed upon the humankind. And then the third thing that we'll talk about today is celebrating the days of Allah, Ayyamillah. And then, as I said, mentioning the purposes of the stories. Because you know, Quran has stories, not like the Bible, because we would find way more stories, especially in the Old Testament. But Quran does contain a lot of stories too. And what's the reason behind that, and so on. So we'll talk about them tonight, inshallah. So first thing, let's focus on the days of Allah, Ayyamillah. With regards to the days of Allah, events that He has caused to happen, such as His bestowing blessings upon His obedient servants and punishing the offenders. And for example, it has the stories of the people of Nuh alayhi salam, Ad, Thamud, which Arabs had received from their forefathers. So what he's trying to say here is that the days when these particular nations that were saved, the believers, that were saved from their brutal leaders or from the wrong society, those were the days of celebration. Those were the days of, celebrating the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or commemorating those days. An example of that is, for example, Yawm al-Ashura, the day of Ashura. As the Jews, they call it Yom Kippur. That's just an example of that. And some people, they will say, well, we don't know all of these days. We don't have them in the calendar when Allah saved the believers from Thamud, believers during the time of the punishment when He sent to the Thamud, or believers of the Ad. So we may not know those days, but that particular community that used to live back in those days, they knew exactly when was the day when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved the believers from the punishment of God. When God saved the believers from His own punishment towards the disbelievers. Lut, for example, Sayyidina Lut and the family. The angels, when they went there, they told him that we are sent here in order to do what? In order to punish, in order to send the punishment upon these people, because these are bad people. And when the believers were saved, Nuh alayhi salam with the believers, when they were saved, that's the day that was commemorated within that community, within that nation. Or Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved Nuh and the followers from that nation who used to give them so much hard time, and they used to punish the believers and so on. So that was a day of celebration of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We call these the Ayyamillah, the days of God. Alright, so that's when it comes to the Ayyamillah. Now, the purposes of the story is the other topic that we're going to talk about. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extracted a group of the famous stories that would be useful for reminder and exhortation. But He did not narrate the stories in their entirety with every particular detail. The reason behind this is that when people hear a unique and strange story, or when a story is mentioned to them with all the details and particulars, their interest inclines towards the story itself, and they miss the fundamental objective of that story, which is the reminder. Again, there would be some people too that you may know, and you say, you know what, this person has talked for a long time, and I still don't know what is the essence of that talk. What is he trying to say? Right? He is telling you a story, and from one story goes to another story, and from that story goes to another story, and there is no connection of points. Why? Because the attention of the speaker, or maybe the speaker was right, but the listener, since the conversation was probably too long, the stories were too long, they are not able to draw the lesson of that story. And that's not what you see in the Quran. Yes, the Quran has stories, but the stories are short, except for Surah Yusuf. That's an exception. But the other stories, when you go through them, you would see that they are short. Allah does not take the whole chapter talking about one particular story. Why? Because it becomes more about the story and not the message of the story. You see what I'm saying? And people tend to lose that. They tend to focus on the story itself instead of drawing those lessons out of the story. So that's an important understanding that we need to have when it comes to the qisas, when it comes to the stories being mentioned in the Quran. So you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizing more in the messages, whether it is before it or through the story or after the story, where the messages are being highlighted, the lessons behind those stories. The other thing is, when it comes to the stories of the Quran are often repeated. And we'll talk very quickly about those, and we'll close it with those inshallah. There are repeated stories in the Quran. For example, you're going to come across the story of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, right? You're gonna come across that story in Surah Ali Imran, in Surah Maryam, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and maybe a few places here and there. You hear about the story of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam. You will see that in Surah Hud. You will see that in Surah Nuh. You come across the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, Surah Al-Qasas, Surah Taha, and many other places throughout the Quran. So, and there are some stories in the Quran where you hear them only once. There is no repetition of that story. But these other prophets that I just mentioned earlier, they are repeated in multiple places in the Quran. Then the reason is why? Why that repetition? As a matter of fact, some people who are very critical about the Quran, they would take these stories and they would say that it is unnecessary repetition, why they're being repeated. And they consider it as a negative aspect of the book itself. But Imam Suyuti has written beautiful subjects on this, has some beautiful writings on this subject, and many other scholars throughout the centuries. But I can wrap it up in a few words, that when you look at the Quran, subhanallah, Quran is considered to be a miracle from the linguistic point of view. There are gharaib al-Quran, there are all of these i'jaz al-Quran that many scholars throughout the centuries they have written. Books, volumes of books, about the way how these words are being put together and what a particular word symbolizes in this surah, and why they go into such details, why here in this surah you don't have the wow and here in the other surah you have the wow. Why here it is a different conjugation of the verb, and in a different surah talking about the same story it's a different conjugation. What is the difference between these two? Scholars, as I said, they have written books. This is all a part of that i'jaz al-Quran, the miracle of the Quran in the language itself. Somebody who doesn't speak Arabic can take the Quran and say like, I mean, this looks good and everything right, but I don't see that much miracles with the words and all that. Remember, you're dealing with the original language here, referring to the Arabic language. Possibly in English too, you might find beautiful things too, but we don't claim that the English version of the English translation of the Quran is the true Quran, the real Quran, right? That's the meaning of the Quran. So if you want to look for the miracles of the Quran, you got to go into the original language. You got to be a master of the Arabic language in order for you, not necessarily just a master, but the more mastery you have, the more you come to understand those jewels of the language. I mean, the jewels of the Quran. But also the basic people, I mean, Arabs in general, they will see that, they will be able to testify a lot of these beautiful nuances of the language that is being used in the Quran. So, as I said, the repetition, it has this i'jaz, it has these miracles. And here's the bottom line, and we'll close it with this one, inshallah. These stories, when they are being mentioned, they're not mentioned in the exact same order as they would be mentioned in a different place. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a particular surah, He can give you some details, about the story of Nuh alayhi salam. And in a different surah, He can still talk about the same story, but give you some different nuances of that. Subhanallah. People, if they hear for a long time the same thing, if they are hearing the story, the focus may be very short. But if the same story is being repeated somewhere else, but giving you some different details and giving you some different messages through that one, making you understand something, realize something different, that is the beauty, or that is the ability of the writer. And in this case, we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is able to give you these different messages, even though it is the same story, but giving you different nuances in the same story. Purposely, in order for you not to make it boring, not to make it for you like thinking too much about that story, and no. Concise, straight to the point, give you different nuances by the story being repeated different times, and at the same time delivering the messages through those stories that are being repeated. And we can keep talking and talking. There are scholars, as I said, who have written on the subject itself, why the stories are being repeated in the Quran, and the beautiful jewels, as I said, from these stories in their books of tafsirs. And they keep writing actually in the ijaz of Quran, ijaz lugawi, yani from the linguistic perspective, not from scientific perspective, like the sun and the moon and the measurements and all of that stuff, geology and history. And no, from the linguistic point of view, the miracle in the language of the Quran. They have been writing beautiful things. So we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the Quran a book of understanding for all of us. Wa sallallahu wa sallam barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.